Hi, I'm author and publisher Mark David Welsh, and welcome to No Book Left Behind. And today we'll be reading The Detectives. So thanks for joining me today for reading The Detectives. And what's it all about? Well, very recently I discovered an old television show made in the UK by Thames Television called The Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. It was 26 50-minute episodes, each based on a short story written around the turn of the 20th century, featuring a detective, most of whom are almost completely lost to time, as far as I'm aware. I'd certainly never heard of any of them, and I thoroughly enjoyed the show, and I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to examine the original stories and see if I could discover any new authors to fall in love with. Now, you might think that with 26 episodes, we're going to have 26 detectives to look at, but that's not actually the case. Several of the detectives, 4 in fact, appeared twice. So you can knock that down to 22 to start with. And also, some of the featured main characters in some of the other stories aren't really detectives. They're spies, they're con men, some are even criminals, a jewel thief, for example. And there's one story where the detective is actually originally a much smaller supporting role in the original story. So I didn't count that one either. And at the end of the day, what we end up with was about 15 detectives to look at. And today, we're going to start with Baroness Orczy, author of The Scarlet Pimpernel most famously, but also creator of Lady Molly of the Yard.
Hello, it's Mark from the editing suite here. Putting this one together, I realised that throughout I refer to this book as Lady Molly of the Yard, when it's actually called Lady Molly of Scotland Yard. Am I stupid? Yes, most definitely. Am I going to redo the entire video? You've got to be kidding.
Now, I don't have a physical copy of the book to show you. It's not difficult to find. It doesn't cost very much, a few pounds. But basically, I could download a copy to my Kobo digitally for only 99 pence, which in American money is less than $1.50. So that did seem kind of the way to go. So who was Lady Molly? Well, she was the star of a dozen short stories written by Baroness Orczy, which feel very much like they would have appeared in magazines at the start of the 20th century, mainly because there's no overarching narrative, there's no real overall story development with them. Until you get to the very end with the last 2 stories, and Sir Jeremiah's Will, the penultimate one, serves as an origin story for the character, and the final story, appropriately titled The End, kind of wraps up her career as a detective. But surprisingly, these did not appear in magazines, but were published instead as one volume in 1910 by a London company called Cassell & Company. And it was an instant hit, selling out its first 2 runs completely, necessitating a 3rd edition published in its very first year of publication. So instead of an origin story, the first tale, the 9-score mystery, finds Lady Molly already working at the Yard in something called the Female Department. And she's assisted by another officer named Mary Grenard, who basically acts as her Dr. Watson and narrates the tales. Now, we don't get any clear idea what their duties have been at the Yard up until this point, but Lady Molly's constant badgering of her superiors finally gets her assigned to a months-old murder case that's taken place in a small village called 9-score, and has baffled the male detectives completely. Now, of course, Lady Molly solves the case, and as a result her stock rises in the Yard quite considerably, to the extent which she gets sent in as an afterthought on various other crimes. Now, leaving aside the gender politics of this particular arrangement, this actually suits Lady Molly's methodology pretty well, because she's not one to collect physical evidence at the crime scene. She's not one to interview suspects just after a murder has been committed. Her methods really do suit being called in very much after the fact. You see, Lady Molly solves her crimes primarily through her intimate knowledge of human behaviour, use of psychology, and her woman's intuition. And if that sounds a little patronising, well, I didn't write this character, so don't blame me. And if in case we forget, it was written by a woman. But I think it's fair to say Sherlock Holmes would not approve. To quote the great detective for a second, "It is a capital mistake to theorise before one has data. Insensibly one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts." In other words, someone uncharitable might describe Lady Molly's methods of crime solving as educated guesswork. As an example, in what's probably the weakest story in the entire collection, called A Christmas Tragedy, Lady Molly basically tricks her suspect into confessing their guilt. She has no evidence that this is the guilty party at all. It's all just circumstantial, and she's basically making a guess. Now, this is obviously not particularly satisfying, and that is a bit of a problem with most of the stories here. The mysteries aren't very intriguing, compelling, or memorable. And there's also a strange lack of any kind of a period flavour, which normally makes these kind of stories so engrossing. However, I would say the best of the bunch are probably worth your time. Opening Tale, The Nine Score Mystery, I think falls into that category, although it doesn't paint a very flattering portrait of the boys in blue of the era. They make a very stupid assumption here, which means they are never going to crack the case. And Lady Molly coming along afterwards is able to see it very easily, as I'm sure the reader will too. I don't know what detective was in charge at the time. The only thing I can assume is that it was Inspector Lestrade or something. Now, the other big standout for me was The Woman in the Big Hat, the tale that they adapted for the TV show, particularly because it very smartly figures that Lady Molly's gender helps her solve the case. She notices things that the male counterparts simply wouldn't get and don't, and I thought that was particularly clever. Now, detractors have pointed out that they feel Mary's narration is deeply flawed, particularly her endless veneration of Lady Molly and Lady Molly's aristocratic status. Now, I didn't have a great problem with it, but I did feel that Mary would have probably appreciated a more intimate relationship with Lady Molly than she's able to achieve. Now, there's nothing overt in the stories to back that up, but you certainly can read that into them. What I had more of a problem with was the way the working classes are portrayed. They're seen almost without exception as untrustworthy, dodgy, shiftless, borderline criminals. The women in particular come off very badly here, almost all of them being shown as cheap, slovenly, and really not to be trusted. Ortsey is of course best known for the Scarlet Pimpernel, a character she created along with her husband Montague Barstow for a stage play, but later she put him in a series of best-selling novels and short story collections. But Lady Molly wasn't her only detective. She also wrote a series of short stories about a character called the Old Man in the Corner, who was an armchair detective who seems to bear more than a slight resemblance to Rex Stout's more famous Nero Wolfe character. One of the episodes of the Rivals of Sherlock Holmes TV show does feature the Old Man in the Corner. Apparently, though, it's a rather loose adaptation, at least that's the impression I get, but I may do a video on it at some point. On the one hand, Lady Molly does seem a pleasingly progressive character, certainly at first sight. Unfortunately, I found her to be a little regressive as well, specifically because of her investigative mythology, which does seem a little bit hit and miss, to be kind. Although, of course, in the tales, it's absolutely infallible. Although, to be honest, it does seem a bit of a stretch given that it's really mostly educated guesswork. You might also be surprised to learn that Lady Molly was far from fiction's first female detective. That honour belongs to a character called Miss G, who appeared in a book called The Female Detective by Andrew Forrester Jr. And the publication of that one was followed just a few months later by Revelations of a Lady Detective by a writer called William Stevens Hayward. And the year? 1864. And the reason for these publications was probably just mirroring real life, because women had started working as private investigators in the 1850s, although admittedly for male-led agencies. And it's quite possible that Orczy got her main inspiration from real life too, a character called Maud West, who opened her own private investigation agency in the UK in 1905, and whose exploits were so well known they were recorded in newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic. Orczy's main innovation with Lady Molly seems to be giving her a post actually within Britain's most famous investigative agency, Scotland Yard. And that's my take on Lady Molly of the Yard. Certainly I think it's worth a read if you're curious about the character and if you're keen on detective fiction of that period. Although I would say don't expect too much from it. Have you read Lady Molly of the Yard? Have you even heard of her? Are there any other Victorian or Edwardian detectives you'd like to see me cover on the channel? I'd appreciate any suggestions in the comments below. I'd also appreciate if you hit the like button and subscribed. That would really be appreciated. But until next time, I'll see you later. I must think of a better sign off.